Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We're starting off a series on Louis Sullivan. He's one of my favorite thinkers. He's a lot higher than what I am, so I always struggle. I've read many times, but I'm always struggling to get what he's saying and implementing that. So I have called in for reinforcements. So I have got my friends here, Sherri, Tracinski, Rupali Sharma, Joia, and Maritza, who are going to be panelists, who are going to be talking about their own takes on Louis Sullivan. This is an introductory meetup. So we're going to say, why Louis Sullivan? And what is it that Louis Sullivan has done for each of us? What are we looking forward to? We're going to choose, we've selected Kindergarten Chats as the book that we're going to go through, but we'll be talking about Louis Sullivan's ideas in general. All right, so first up is going to be Sherri. Sherri, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I thought every time I bring up a conversation about Louis Sullivan, I always have to tell the story of the very first time that I met Srikant in person. He and Rob knew each other for many years before that. And if you watch the other video that we had done, you probably heard the story, but maybe it'll come out the same, I'm not sure. But we were at a conference and Srikant had already spoken to Rob, and he came up to me, introduced himself, and then the very next words were, "Have you read Louis Sullivan? Have you read Kindergarten Chats?" And I looked at him because it came to me at the moment, no one else had ever in my entire life introduced themselves in such a way. And so, of course, I was an architecture student. I believe I was maybe out of school by that. I don't remember if I was still in school or not, but I was in Chicago at the time. And I, of course, had read Louis Sullivan. It's a Kindergarten Chats. It's essentially first year architecture student requirement. You read it in your art history class or your architectural history class, or maybe in your studio class or something like that. It's one of the very first pieces of literature that you're reading on architecture. So it's so much a part of, to me, what it is to learn about architecture, that it's kind of just in the air, as it were. So it was very strange for me to have somebody ask that question, which began a long standing set of very fun conversations. Just about every time we get together, there's going to have to be some discussion of Louis Sullivan. And over the years, I don't know how many times I've read the book now, Louis Sullivan's book, Kindergarten Chats. I have it so heavily highlighted because there was one reading where I read it in green highlighter. If you're closer, you can see there's a reading where I read it in pencil. So there are markings in the margins in pencil. There's another reading where it was in pen, blue pen or black pen. So it's really funny because I can go through the same book and see what caught my attention every single time. At this point, I'm going to have to either pull out a colored pencil or a different colored highlighter, something different in order to identify which reading it is this time. And the funniest thing is sometimes they're underlined, they're highlighted in green, and then they're underlined in pencil with exclamations in pen on the sidebars. So it's a very influential book in my mind for me personally. But beyond that, why everybody else should read it is it's extremely influential in architecture, modern architecture. Louis Sullivan was one of what is called the Chicago School of Architects. And it wasn't an actual school, it's just a school of thought. Several architects in Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire, in the rebuilding of the city, started really thinking through architecture for it to be how we're dealing with brand new materials, brand new forms. We're thinking of taller buildings at this point in time. So they were using this as an opportunity to examine and rethink everything that they were doing. How do you approach architecture with all these new parameters, new building types, new materials? And so it really began the formation of what grew into modern architecture. And what really is this idea of form follows function, taken in radically different ways by individual architects throughout the rest of, from then on. But every single version, there's always a tie back to Louis Sullivan's ideas. Sometimes if you look at the examples side by side, it's really hard to imagine there's a connection, but there really is. So for those of you who have a background of architectural history or have some knowledge of it, you can trace Louis Sullivan's ideas through to Frank Lloyd Wright's ideas. When it jumps to Japan, when Frank Lloyd Wright was working in Japan, is picked up by the German international Bauhaus and international style architects who were in Germany and then in Chicago, right back to Chicago again, which then formed international style modernism. So it's a thread that crosses the globe and comes back and reflowers again and again and in different ways. But beyond an interest in architecture, Louis Sullivan's ideas, he takes it outside of that. To him, his ideas really expand into politics, into education, into how each of us needs to make sure we are making our own observations at the world and not just following what other people are saying and accepting that without our own careful observations. So it's fun to read him, I think. Maybe takes a little, for some people, it takes a little while to kind of get into the groove of reading Sullivan's style writing. Rob and I'm stealing this one from Rob, by the way, and I'm taking it as my own.
Yeah.
What was the phrase we used?
Elaborate curlicues of thought.
Yeah, elaborate curlicues of thought sometimes, but that happens. But you'll notice that you'll see that in his architecture too. The way he writes is also the way he builds. The very same love of decoration to what he's building or writing. But I think my favorite thing about Louis Sullivan is his sense of humor. When he writes, once you get into reading it, it's very, very barbed, very sharp sense of humor. And you've got to read carefully to catch all of the jokes that he is putting in there. And it's one of those things like we've talked about in previous meetups about how art is the better art it is, the more value you get out of re-looking at it and re-examining it and digging deeper. That is definitely the case, I think, with Sullivan.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I was kind of debating between whether we should do kindergarten chats or autobiography of an idea. I think kindergarten chats is very powerful in terms of laying out the entire range of his ideas, but autobiography is very good at showing how his ideas came to be. So anybody who wants, you can start reading that book in parallel. It goes very well with this one. Next up is Rupali.
We could just do one and then follow up with the next behind.
Do that too. We could do that too. Wonderful. Next up is going to be Rupali. Rupali.
Great. So I will also start similarly with how I got to learn about Louis Sullivan, just like Sherri mentioned. So as an architecture student, I was, fascinated by Frank Lloyd Wright's work. And in the third year of architecture in India, we were studying temples and architecture of Indian temples, which they're beautiful, very well decorated, but it's from the past. And growing up in a society where everything was, very traditional, there are expectations. Uh, as a young student, I was trying to break away from that. And when I was reading Frank Lloyd Wright's work, he constantly mentioned his labor master, beloved teacher, right? And I was curious, so I started reading Louis Sullivan's work. And when I saw his buildings, I was just looking at pictures and the way they stood firmly in the place that they were built. They were very um, definite in their shape, and yet they had like this ornamentation that would draw you to see more. And the more you looked at it, the more you saw. So what it gave to me was this idea that there's more than just the past. There's something in the future that you can look at. And so my friend and I, we would spend hours in the library looking at and reading about his work. But I had not read Kindergarten Chats. So the very first time I met Shrikant, so Sherri, it's so similar. I told him I was an architect, and he said, "Oh, have you read Louis Sullivan's work, Kindergarten Chats?" And I said, "No," but I was so shocked that somebody who is not an architect knew about Louis Sullivan. That was so, it had never happened before that. So then this is the book that Shrikant gave me right away to read. And, it has been a very transformative book for me, I would say, because when I first read it, I read it as an architect. And there's a lot in there about how you look at a building, how you look at, the integrity of a building, not just the outward form, but what it offers. And architecture is one art form that we live with and live outside of every single day in our society. And how has architecture evolved over all these civilizations, not just where we are today, but it also tells you stories of the past, and it tells you where we are today and then how we are going to shape our future and what's to come. So for me, that was the big learning when I first read it. But then as I changed my career from architecture to being a parent and then being an educator, I realized, the things that he talks about in the book are how to observe, how to pay attention to details. What are the things that you're looking at? And he focuses a lot on nature. And when he talks about looking at nature, it's both literary and in metaphorically. So you're getting lessons from nature. You're just looking at perhaps a flower. But if you look at a sunflower, you just see the shape on the outside. But then when you look closely, you can see the patterns, you can see the geometry, you can see there's so much more, the Fibonacci sequence, and you can go on and on with just one sunflower. So then how do you transfer that knowledge to what you create? And that's in the ornamentation that you see that Louis Sullivan does. He's also extremely poetic when he writes, and he was very well read. So as an educator, when he talks about language and uses the language, the nouns and the verbs and the adjectives in form of buildings, or here's a salad and there's too much dressing, what does that mean? Or when the recipe is just right. So there are so many different images that he creates while reading that it keeps you engaged. I will say, just like Sherri mentioned before, that it takes a while to get used to his style, and to kind of keep following what he's saying. As an educator now, I teach design to children kindergarten to grade 8. And when they design different elements, we often come back to form follows function. And I tell them the story of Louis Sullivan because even with the smallest things that we design, we think, it's important to just see what are the basic elements of anything that you design. And so over the years, our students have learned about different architects, and Louis Sullivan being one of them. So then, if I say, well, why do we study Louis Sullivan? Why should we study Louis Sullivan? I would say the very first thing that comes to my mind is his sense of life, that there is, opportunity for all human beings to seek something at a much higher level, at, what are your highest ideals? What are your values that you are aspiring to achieve? Things that are beautiful. All of his work, there's a lot of beauty in the work that he creates. And then he implores the reader to say, what is it that you can create through this book? He's transforming the reader also. The other big part, the point that he makes, is the connection between freedom and creativity. And to be in a free society, and he is a champion of democracy in his book. And he talks about, the link between freedom and how creativity is nurtured in that environment. So as a Montessori educator, I truly believe that the environment makes a big difference to an individual. And when you're talking about architecture, we're talking about a society. So a free society naturally lends itself to developing many more creative ideas, an open society where you can experiment, you can try out new things without any fear. And that's a big part, I feel. The third big reason is independent thinking. He talks a lot about thought. Why is it important to develop independent thinking? And again, thinking is not something that comes naturally. It's not like a child learning to walk and talk, but it's a skill that you have to teach. You have to train your mind not to wander and to stay focused, to make a thought, go away, read something, do something else, make connections, connect the dots, and then create your own thought. So independent thinking is a big element. And then to me, as an educator, I feel that he talks about education as a gardener. And Maria Montessori, so I teach at a Montessori school, and Maria Montessori talks about sowing the seeds of knowledge in a fertile land. My father comes from a big background of making fertilizers and soil and things like that. So I grew up with that, in that environment. And I know that if you provide the right elements, the seed will really grow to its fullest potential, bearing fruit, and then the offspring too. So when he talks about education, he talks about how every person has an inherent potential. You're born with that potential. So what is it that adults, mentors, teachers, whether you are in architecture, whether you are in any other field of study, what is the role of teachers while we are educating our children? And is it to tell them what to think, or is it to teach them how to think? How are you pruning that plant, or how are you pruning that mind so that it can really develop into its fullest potential? So right now, for me, that is probably the most a concrete link with what Louis Sullivan's work. And of course, as an architect, reading Louis Sullivan's work, I think I became a better observer, a thinker, and a creator, because he talks about creating your own things by thinking for yourself. So you're not imitating things from what the past was, or you're not imitating what's in fashion right now, but you're creating your own creations based on your own thought. He talks about practice and discipline going hand in hand. So there are many, as a human being, there are many lessons that we can take from this reading, from the reading of Kindergarten Chats. It's really a book that's packed with a lot of information. So then I was saying to Shrikant, what would happen if we didn't study Louis Sullivan, right? We're talking about why study Louis Sullivan, but what if we didn't study Louis Sullivan? What would we miss? Not as sarcasm. I don't think we would miss that, but we'd miss a lot. We'd miss a man with a vision of what architecture ought to be. What, as Sherri mentioned before, he is really the father of modern architecture. And we would miss lessons in observation and contemplation, that observations and deep thought together help us make new designs, make us come up with creative ideas. And this ties back with Chuck's idea of creating your own snowmobile, right? You have to make those connections, remove those elements, and then put them again together in a new form. And that only happens by in an iterative process. You have to work at it. When Louis Sullivan started, he didn't create his very first masterpiece as an architect, but he did a lot of projects. He was prolific in his work. He did over 100 buildings within a span of 14 years. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of thinking. That's a lot of detailing. And that requires a lot of dedication, and you're constantly coming up with new ideas. You're trying, you're prototyping, you're putting things together, then you come up with new ideas, and then finally you come to that right recipe. So I think that process is something we would have missed if we didn't talk about Louis Sullivan. The second thing that I want to talk about is his language. His language is very poetic, and I want to share my screen over here, Shrikant. So I'll just share this poem. When I first came to America, I read this poem. Actually, Rohit introduced me to this poem by Henry Van Dyke, America for Me. And this poem captures what Louis Sullivan says. It's fine to see the old world and travel up and down among the famous palaces of cities of renown, to admire the crumbly castles and the statues of the kings. But now I think I've had enough of antiquated things. So it's home again and home again, America for me. My heart is turning home again, and there I long to be. In the land of youth and freedom beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars. And when you look at Louis Sullivan's work, you do feel this lightness, this brightness, this energy that of freedom, of when we talk about youth and freedom, something new. It's not shackled by the past at all. And I'm going to just scroll down to the bottom. And he says that in his work, Louis Sullivan started studying at MIT, then he moved to Paris to study, and then he traveled to Italy, saw the structures from Renaissance, was highly influenced, came back and created his own style. But one of the things in this poem that resonates with his journey is, I know that Europe's wonderful, yet something seems to lack. The past is too much with her and the people looking back. But the glory of the present is to make the future free. We love our land for what she is and what she is to be. Oh, it's home again and home again, America for me. I want a ship that's westward bound to plow the rolling sea. To the blessed land of room enough beyond the ocean bars, where the air is full of sunlight and the flag is full of stars. So he's talking about, traditions, ornamentation, all of that was in the classical style. And looking back, we can learn from the structures from the past, but we cannot keep doing the same over and over. So he actually looked at the future. He looked at what we need to change today. There was an opportunity in Chicago. There were new materials, there was scientific discovery, and he was able to put that together to create something new. So if we didn't study Louis Sullivan, we would miss this poetic manifestation in structures. And one of the things he says early on in the book is that, when you're looking at structures, look at the story that the building is trying to tell you. Every creation tells a story of the creator behind it. And he tells us that we are all poets, and it's up to us to look inside. And when I first read the book, I remember thinking that, you don't see things, he says in the book, you do not see things now, but a little later, things will begin to see you and beckon to you. And that's something I feel now, having the experience of being an architect, being a parent, being an educator, as a person who keeps changing wherever you are in your plane of development, then you see more and understand more. So I think, this book helps in that journey. So I would just end with this, that if this is a book, if you want to think about making changes for a better life, if you think about, what do I need to think for myself, to create a life of meaning for myself, then this is a book that is very transformative. By the end of the book, the student in architecture is transformed. And similarly, by the end of this book, as I read the book, I felt I was transformed. And I've read this book multiple times. And again, this book is packed with so much information that every time you read, there's more to learn. And so just to end, I would say, Louis Sullivan teaches us to observe, to take care of ourselves, and then create things that are meaningful, that will make a mark on society as we live through the civilization of ours.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Fantastic. I just want to follow up on the theme of education here. This book, the theme of it is that a student who has finished his education goes to Louis Sullivan for education. What he's doing is, and what Louis Sullivan does is, he has to get the student to unlearn things and then to teach. And that's the process through which everybody needs to go. And that's the challenge of it. There is a lot to unlearn, actually. A lot of it is just unlearning. And then once you get those things out of you, then you yourself have to make the observations to learn. And it's a profound book. And whatever you get from it is going to be yours, in the sense that you have to do the work. What all of us, the other folks, can do is to just talk about our own experience. And you have to engage the book yourself. All right, next up is going to be Maritza.
Hi, so I am not an architect. And I had not previously read this book. So I'm going to be going through this journey with the rest of you, and we'll see what we come out as at the end, right? I bought the book immediately following Shrikant's discussion when he invited Sherri to come and do a presentation for us for Comprehensivist Wednesday. So I was intrigued enough by that discussion that I went and bought the book. And I hadn't gotten around to reading it yet. So it's perfect that we decided to do this, because that was the impetus to pick it up off my shelf and read it. So there's so many things here that have been said. I'm kind of still unpacking them a little in my brain. Rupali, that was amazing. So I think that there's so much in this world that we just don't see. And I'm intrigued by the concept of an architect telling us, be observant and, see things in different ways. Because I think that the discerning eye of an architect is possibly uniquely qualified in that way. I have to say, on the very, okay, this is page 5 of the book. It's the editorial notes. I have the revised version, so I don't know if they're the same for everyone. There was a line here that I'm actually going to share with you guys, because I actually read that and I had to stop reading. I was like, what? And I had to stop and contemplate it for a while before I could get further. So I literally got through one paragraph before I had to stop and go sit and ponder life. It says, Sullivan believed that a building represented an act, and that such an act revealed the man behind it, the mind and ethics of the architect, more conclusively and unerringly than any statement. Even reading it now, my mind is going, wow. I don't know if you guys feel that way, but that's what that said to me. And so I am really excited to keep, going forward. I have read more of it now, but I didn't that day. I actually really literally went and sat down and just started writing, and just on that statement, piecing it apart, how I saw it. I think that it's so vital and critical for us to find ways for independent thinking in a world ever full of just so many things encouraging a lack of thinking, just for a better way of saying it, where so many things are made easy, so many things are automated. It's just really simple to just, be an automaton without even realizing that that's what you're doing. So like I said, I'm not an architect. Most of my background is in finance, but I actually do have a certification in tree pruning. And I've, so the thing that I see in the little bit that I have read so far on Louis Sullivan is it does bring to mind what you learn when you're trying to prune a fruit tree. There different shapes require different aspects, and there's different things you have to do, and there is you must sacrifice certain branches for the improvement of the tree. And when pruning a tree, it's actually brutally difficult. For somebody who really likes trees, pruning is it's hard. It's gut-wrenchingly hard for me to have shears in my hand and to prune fruit trees. I feel like I'm killing them. I'm so sorry, so sorry. But you have to, right? Because that's gonna make it healthier. And even a peach tree is a given tree. It just wants to give you fruit and give you fruit and give you fruit. But you have to not let it. So you have to viciously remove its babies. And you're like, what? But if you don't, the tree it's unhealthy. When it's really young, it doesn't put enough energy into the branches. And so it doesn't grow up to be a strong tree that can give you peaches forever and ever. So you have to be almost brutal with it when it's a baby tree. And that seems, kind of counterintuitive, but I can see that a little bit in kind of what we're being told here in some of the writings from Louis Sullivan, is that reshape your brain to see things in different ways. And I really like the way Shrikant just said it, you have to unlearn things, because I really think that that's that I can totally see that's what he's saying. That, you know, we have to rethink, and it is that the writing style is interesting, because it does seem like he's telling this student, there, little grasshopper, you know nothing, but it's okay, because maybe you'll figure things out. And I think it's going to be a wild ride for us guys. I really think that every other sentence is going to cause us to think. There are some big words in here also, and so I'm like I mentioned to Shika, I'm kind of the new kid on the block here, but I'm excited to, you know, go through this with you guys and keep sharing with you what I see. Thanks.
Wonderful, Maritza. I think you're going to have a blast. Okay, you have two things going for you. One is you like trees, and second, you like poetry. Okay, so I think you may be able to get more out of Louis Sullivan than any of us. It's and the thing is that so because it's all about trees and how trees grow and how growth happens, and how there is kind of this the thing that you talked about of pruning, thinking about the immediate consequences and the consequences afterwards. What shape does it need to be for it to grow effectively? And there is a sense of beauty. There is almost a aesthetic to it, in addition to calculation, and he embodies that. So I think you're going to get a lot out of this one. Next up is going to be Joia.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm so excited. I think Maritza is right that we are up for a really wild and fantastic ride. I can't wait to see even what Maritza is going to get out of this. I think people who've read the book know that one of Louis Sullivan's favorite phrases is remember the seed. And I feel every time Maritza comes on the call, she's always asking us to essentially remember the seed. So I can't even wait to see how her seed is going to develop just from reading through this book. So I'm going to reiterate what I guess is a common thread on this call and say the reason I picked up this book was because of Shrikant. I think everybody here on the call knows that one of the great things about being friends with Shrikant is we get so many great book recommendations. But of all the wonderful books that I've read because Shrikant recommended them to me, Louis Sullivan, both this and An Autobiography of an Idea, have to be the ones that have had the biggest impact on my life when I read them. It's over 10 years ago now. And I realized I'm at this really interesting stage in my own life and development, as Rupali was pointing out, that, you know, through life, we go through different stages of growth and development. So one thing I realized, I don't think I've even yet mentioned on these calls, even though we've been doing weeks worth of discussions about art and creativity and the creative process, is that I'm actually myself working on writing a novel. And I want to have a character in my novel that is based on Louis Sullivan. So I already had in the back of my mind that I wanted to do this deep dive into, again, both kindergarten chats and Autobiography of an Idea. And then at one point I was talking with my good friend, Chris Bush, who's also on this call, and I'm sure he'll come on at some point and tell you all his own story, but he is also someone in the architecture field and is recently starting a new architectural project of his own. And we started talking about Louis Sullivan and even thinking about Louis Sullivan as an example and an emblem of, we would both agree, of one of our creative heroes. And that is, we're both embarking on these major creative projects, how wonderful it would be to do this deep dive with one of our creative heroes. So then I reached out to Shrikant because I know this is one of his favorite books, and he and Sherri already did those two great introductory talks about Louis Sullivan. So if anyone here hasn't seen, there already are two great conversations about Louis Sullivan that Shrikant and Sherri did that are on 52 Living Ideas. So everyone should definitely check those out. I think it just sets the ground for everything we're doing here. And to me, it's amazing that we have everybody here on this call, and to have the insights from Rupali and Maritza and even I see the people that we have who are also on the call who I think are going to contribute to the chat and the conversation. I can't wait to see what we're going to pull out of Louis Sullivan. But to get specifically to my why read Louis Sullivan? For me specifically, why do I even want to have a character based on Louis Sullivan in my novel? And one of the interesting things to me about thinking about my own journey with Louis Sullivan, my first introduction to Louis Sullivan before I knew his name was through the Fountainhead. And people who've been on this series with us know we started out the discussion of Romantic Manifesto by talking about Ayn Rand's novel, The Fountainhead. And in The Fountainhead, she has a character, Henry Cameron, who is based on Louis Sullivan. And in that story, Cameron is a bitter, broken man. And I think that's absolutely a good choice for her story, to have the character who ends up being a mentor for Howard Roark, the protagonist, to have him be this bitter, cynical, pessimistic, broken figure who then is brought back to life by his interaction with Howard Roark. And interestingly, there is a real parallel between Cameron and Louis Sullivan, in that, similarly to the story that Ayn Rand tells, that Cameron was this architect, had these really innovative ideas about modernist architecture and had gotten started on what was to be a really vibrant career. And then at the peak of when he was just really starting to get into his prime, there was this Columbia exposition, and suddenly there was this revival of old neoclassical styles, and suddenly Louis Sullivan's architectural vision went out of style, and then he struggled throughout his life to find work. And Louis Sullivan, the real person, I think, had every reason to be someone who was bitter and cynical and pessimistic. But to me, what's most striking about Louis Sullivan, and that really comes through in this book, is how he was the exact opposite of that. So, not to give away the story, but the final chapters of this book are called Optimism and Spring Song. And so, similar to Sherri, if you see my book, my copy of this book, there's all sorts of notes on just about every single line of this book. But what I wrote here at the end in my notes, I wrote, think about how tragically frustrating Louis Sullivan's life was. But he ends with optimism and spring song. That is the triumph. And to me, that's what I'm so excited to explore about this person. Someone who could live through that experience and come through at the end with this vibrant, hopeful, optimistic, flourishing sense of life. This is a person who really knew how to live, how to thrive as a human being. And I think it's powerful lessons that I hope we all can learn from his example.
So let me tell you a little bit of the story. Sherri, Rupali, and Joia talked about my recommending the book to them. I have to tell you this story. So when I read the book, I was completely blown away. I thought this was the greatest thing. And I bought 32 copies of it. And I gave it to anybody whom I thought was worthwhile. Okay, I just gave away all the copies. And then I found something very stunning. There were people like Rupali, for example, or Joia, who really took to it immediately. Maybe 1/3 of the people were like that. 1/3 of the people said it's kind of interesting. And 1/3 of the people said, what is this? Why did you give me this? What is it saying? I don't even know what they're saying. So I said, what explains all of this? Because to me, it was very, very plain what he was saying. So what I ended up doing was that I rewrote the book. It took me a year to do that, but I rewrote the whole thing. I just edited it. I just, so that, because what happens is that the language is very flowery. He's using terms, so I kind of cut things down. I kind of edited it and I wrote it. I published it on the blog. I don't recommend it because I wanted you to read the original thing. I kept on saying on this blog post that, okay, don't, read it only enough to get motivated to read the original thing, because there is nothing like reading the original thing. And again, it kind of points to my, what I say about this. And again, I recommend this to you. This technology is very, very powerful. Okay, so even when you are reading in print, I retyped the whole book. Okay, because what happens is that when you actually start writing, just like Sherri is saying, right? You underline it, you write on the things, you make your own notes, and you put it all together. That's the only way to do that. And I have to tell you, this man's thought is so deep that I don't think I get it. Okay, I get some things, and every time I get back to it, I see a completely new level. I see that I've applied it only to some extent. I see a whole new way of looking at it at very deep level in terms of methods and all kinds of things. So that's what we're talking about, folks. So that's what we are up against. And we've got some, some of us have been immersed in Louis Sullivan for a long time. For many of us, it's new. So we're going to have a combination of those, all these perspectives. Now, what I want to do is that I want to take questions for folks. If you are familiar with Louis Sullivan, you are welcome to talk about Louis Sullivan a little bit. If not, you are welcome to ask questions. Give me just a second. Let me go ahead and unmute, because what happens is that will be a good context to, let me see what time it is. We are at 3:23. Folks, do you have any questions? You can go ahead and type an exclamation mark. And meanwhile, I'll prepare the breakout rooms as well. Sherri, do you want to add any thoughts?
I've been intrigued of how it is that people take Louis Sullivan when it's kind of tying into what Shrikant was saying. When they first start reading it, it is a flowery language. And I've had this conversation Shrikant and I had in a museum once. We were looking at, I don't know if you remember this, Shrikant. We were looking at the Chinese carvings that are very, very intricate and intertwining. And we were discussing how both there's some idea behind the Chinese intertwining kind of ornament and the Celtic or Scandinavian style of ornament, which really comes out in Louis Sullivan's work, which I also see in Indian architecture and in decorative arts. And I've often been curious if the reason that it's really hit home with Shrikant is that there may be some element of the prose or the decorative arts of Louis Sullivan that feel home to those who are Indian or those who come from a culture that has that sort of intertwining decorative arts as a basis. And it's just a curious, it's no more formed than that. But I see a connection between all these different cultures that have ornament like that. And I think there is somewhere deep down, there is a similar seed to it. And I'm curious to know as we go on, if this is something Shrikant and I have never, in all of our discussions of Sullivan, have never gotten to that heart of it. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, clearly kind of Indian art is much more flowery than most of the Western art. So part of it is also, it's kind of connected to nature, I think. India is a tropical country and it is full of plants, like full of life. Yes. Compared to that, yes, the temperate countries is lifeless. No, I don't want to say that much, but there is a difference. There is a difference of the sheer, like if you go to India, right, you are just hit with all kinds of colors and shapes and smells, and it's just life. and that's kind of natural, that is around you, and that reflects in the sensibility of people. So you have, if you look at just the colors, they're far more vibrant in Indian cultures, and the shapes and all of that. So there is a connection between that, definitely. Let's take a few questions.
Just
Yes,
add
go ahead.
something. So, Sherri, it's very interesting you mentioned that, because as I said, when I first came across Louis Sullivan, it was in my third year of architecture when we were studying the Indian temples, and they are very geometric in nature, in their planning. But on the outside, they're very much ornamented, and the ornamentation is very geometric also. So it's so you have a square frame behind you, and within that there are some layers, right? So you take basic geometric shapes, circles, triangles, squares, and then experiment within that with diagonals and concentric shapes. And in that, then you add the nature, forms from nature, whether it's a leaf or a flower. So a 13 petal flower or a 5 petal flower, and so on and so forth. So certainly there is that connection. Although I didn't make that connection back then, I do feel that the ornamentation calls to that natural sensibility, as Shrikant said, for people who have grown up with all of that ornamentation or around them. So, yeah.
Wonderful. So folks, let us know if you're planning to read the book with us. You can type in yes if you're planning to read, or no, or maybe if you want. Okay, Jyoti is planning to read, Ash is planning to read. Very good. Next question. Now let's go to questions. Next up is Jyoti.
Okay. I have heard from Shrikant for a long time about Louis Sullivan and his theories. He's truly impressed by him. I can assure you that, because that got me to see some YouTubes. And when I find the time to look at the YouTubes, that means somebody did inspire me to go ahead with it. Okay. And all of you did a great job in explaining his basic ideas. My question to you, please bear with me, because I'm not sure whether I'm formulating my question right or wrong. By now, I have learned a little bit about Jordan Peterson, what's that, Jane, who's that? Yes, and others. I'm asking you this question. How is Sullivan's thinking different than the natural process of thinking, evolution process of thinking and contemplation? I was an educator, professional, parent, wife, children, whatever. I heard Maritza saying and Rupali and Sherri saying things that I probably did it because that was the way to do it. I had peach trees all around me, my children. I pruned them. Sometimes it was harsh, but I did that. I contemplated and I thought about them and re-examined them. How is this any different?
Wonderful. Great question, Jyoti. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, who would like to answer it? What makes Louis Sullivan's thinking different? What do you think Louis Sullivan's way of thinking has to offer to the world?
You want to take that one?
No.
So what I would say is, I don't think that I'm going to answer this question in the fullest form, but my first take on that is Louis Sullivan looked at it more like Emerson or when you look at Thoreau's book on Walden, it's more from that angle that nature has a lot to offer and a lot of life lessons within nature that you can learn from. And he also has a technical background. and a scientific mind. So he's able to connect those two worlds, right? From the natural world and also the scientific world. I think that's where his uniqueness comes from. And you can see that in his structures. His structures are very much according to the engineering, specifications, or like really solid. They don't try to do any gymnastics or anything at all, like some of the modern buildings do. But then the ornamentation is to scale. There's a lot of thought given to how far can you push this material, what are the limits of the material within the constraints of a material. Every material behaves differently. And I think that when we look at Louis Sullivan's work and this book, he's able to bring those two ideas together, that you can learn from nature, but also there's the scientific process that you can build in your thought process. So thinking needs those observations, and it also needs what tools you have on hand to shape what's coming up next. So that's my take on it.
Sherri, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what Jyoti is talking about is getting at is there really anything unique about Sullivan's ideas, or is this just the natural way of thinking? And I think the answer is yes to both of them. What's unique is that Sullivan is very methodically and carefully examining the natural way of thinking that I don't think most of us on this call, but that many people out in the world, like Maritza was saying, just put it on autopilot and move through things. Sullivan doesn't do that. Everything is examined. So I think the answer is yes to both parts of that question. And that's why, as Rupali is saying, you get both that decorative element and you get both that nature and that science, because they're not two separate things in his mind. They're two parts of the same thing.
So Jyoti, that was a fantastic question. That's the right question to ask. It's the question, but you have to realize that it's a question about method of thinking. Method of thinking is a very deep topic. And to figure out even identify the method of thinking is a lot of work. And reading the book would be a good way of kind of bringing it. So all we're saying is that he has something profound to say about method of thinking, because if you can improve your method of thinking even a little bit, the leverage there is very, very high. And you will have to kind of engage the book in order to abstract that out in your own way with a little bit of kind of hints from us in multiple directions. But that's what the endeavor is. And I agree with what both Rupali and Sherri said, that was very good. So next up is going to be Laura, Mike, and Ash. Laura, what's your question? You need to unmute yourself. Oh, just a second. Rob has a comment. Let's do Rob's comment. Hold on for a second. Rob.
Sure. Okay, there you go.
I'm unmuted. Okay, it was meant to be
later.
Whenever you can finish.
Okay.
Okay.
Laura, go ahead.
I have so many things to say. First of all, I resonate with Louis Sullivan, and also the thing about America, after being in Italy for 12 years, I mean, I really felt that way. I wanted to come back to New York. I lived in the historic center in Rome, and I always said, I'm walking through it's a live museum. I walk through this museum every day. And at some point, I don't even appreciate it anymore because it's just part of my everyday life. But I really wanted to come back to America. I want to come back to New York. I always said Rome is the most beautiful city in the world, but New York is the greatest city in the world. And I still will say that. I'll stand by that. But architecture here is pretty ugly, I must say, for sure. Although there's some new stuff coming.
What's your question, Laura?
Okay,
Great comment, but what's your
okay.
question?
I guess it's really about how do we sustain that kind of vision that you get, you know, when that comes up. I mean, how do you make it real in this world? Because I mean, there's so many constraints. I mean, I know he did beautiful buildings, and I know he did skyscrapers, and I know that was like, you know, a great thing, you know, and it was necessary. But he also changed the architecture of the city. I mean, all these beautiful Renaissance buildings that they had disappeared because they needed to build up, you know, because there were too many people in too little space. So how do you sustain that, you know, that kind of Montessori school learning as you know, move into real world working places, where you have to build to somebody else's constraints, but hold to your own value system?
Fantastic question. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, who wants to take that? Okay, I will first answer the first part of it. I definitely hear you. I think Europe is a museum, and the whole place is a museum, and they're afraid to touch anything because they have too much reverence for the past, and they are the past is kind of sitting on their chest. Past is supposed to be your platform on which you stand and go further, whereas it is kind of sitting on their chest, and that is actually limiting what they can do. So I very much identify with that. On the question of how do you keep, given the constraints of what the economy demands of you, how do you keep your approach to design? Sherri, do you want to address that at all?
Yeah, my form of architecture is actually houses. I prefer houses to larger buildings simply because I like that intimacy of working with an individual client on their own house. But we deal with it in a bunch of different ways. You have to value what is given. So you have, say you're renovating a building, you have to value what's given, what's there to start with, and don't indiscriminately toss things aside, which if you're thinking in the way that Louis Sullivan is thinking, that comes naturally. Because if there's something of value, you value it. It's as simple as that.
Rupali?
So that's a very good question, Laura. And, when I'm going to go back to my third year of architecture, when I was reading this book, not this book, but reading about Louis Sullivan, but also studying traditional Indian architecture. And I was looking for a sign of how Louis Sullivan's ideas could be manifested in today's world, because I lived in an area of the city where it was surrounded by old traditional residential architecture, beautiful, very comfortable, very nice area. But, all stone buildings built in a old Indian bungalow style houses. And one day while I was walking through the streets, I came across this staircase, which was literally 1 inch thick. The treads were 1 inch thick in the concrete form, and the risers were also 1 inch thick. And I said, this just cannot be. It cannot stand. And so it was a building. There was the old stone house portions were still kept. And there was this beautiful, very light staircase. And I had to go and climb it to make sure that it was real. So I walked up to it and I stepped on the staircase, and it just sprung. It had a spring to it. And I went on the next step and the next step, and I couldn't believe this was real. And I walked up and down, and this man came from his office. It was within that construction building. And he explained to me that he had actually come up with this new material called ferrocement, and he had developed this technology. It wasn't his own proprietary thing, but he had mastered it enough that he was able to build this really thin staircase, which was the right use of the material to its potential. And so the thing is that, how did he get there? He got there by thinking, by experimenting, by trying. You have to create, you have to build. You cannot just be passively saying, okay, I'm going to do something, but it's not going to happen. It takes a good thinking mind to experiment and try and create something that, similar to Louis Sullivan. And again, he was a structural engineer, and I ended up working with him for many years while in India. But the thing is that it is possible. It is possible to dream, it is possible to think, and it is possible to then create something that's of value to you and represents your values to the world. As Sherri said, this engineer, he kept the old stone structure, it still exists, and then there's this building at the back. And Sherri, to your comment, my thesis was also on ferrocement in my final year. So Sherri and I have that in common.
We're going to have to talk about ferrocement. We'll have to do a whole meetup on ferrocemento, Shrikant.
Says it in the Italian. She did her thesis on nervi.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So,
okay,
Rob.
so on a different topic, somewhat different. See, now you got Sherri talking about concrete and ferrocement. That's dangerous.
He's cutting me off.
Well, so the comment I just want to throw in is
this cement, Sherrish cement is like your politics.
Yeah.
But one thing I wanted to throw in, because I was struck by what Shrikant said about how he gives this book to a lot of different people, and about a third of them love it, and a bunch of them sort of don't get it. And I'm a little more sympathetic to the people who didn't get it, because I find Louis Sullivan, as a writer, Louis Sullivan's writing style kind of drives me nuts, because my writing style is much more simple and spare and less ornamented.
Stuffy.
Yes, but also I think it's because he spends a lot of time with this sort of folksy style and a lot of very intensive wordplay, and it takes a little while to get started. And I found it wasn't until the 5th chapter that you started to really get to the central idea. Mm-hmm. Now, fortunately, the 5th chapter, the chapters are small, so it doesn't take you that long to get to it. But I just want to put in that encouragement that, if you first start reading it thinking, what is this guy saying? It's a bunch of weird wordplay and this sort of folksy style, very late 19th century American kind of thing, to have that very folksy style. And you persist with it a little bit, because you will get to the substantive idea. And I found that chapter 5, I think, was the one that really, that's where he talks about the Marshall Field's department store. Mm-hmm. And I love the fact that, somebody says, well, it's a department store. He says, no, it's not. It's a hotel. He says, no, I've been there. I know it's a department store with offices above. He says, no, it's a hotel, because you if you look with your eyes, with your own eyes, and not at what people are telling you, but with your own eyes at what the building is telling you, then it's something different from what they're telling you it is. If you look with your own eyes, you'll see what the building really is telling you that it is. And I love that, because I think that's what sort of takes it beyond being about architecture and about how to think about things and how to see things with your own eyes, and see from the way something works to see what it is, rather than what people tell you what it is. And boy, is that useful in politics. So just to put that.
Okay, Rob, I'm going to say something. I know it makes you cringe every time I say it, but folks, you don't have to read the book chapter.
No.
In the order in which the writer wrote it. The writer really, really wants you to read it, but you don't necessarily have to read it in that chapter. That's the beautiful thing. See, it works in parallel. See, this is the way in which the book is designed. You can jump to any page and it's okay. Nobody stops you. Okay. So for example, if you find pieces which are hard, actually the chapters are very, very short. So you can just jump to a chapter. It will be good to get to read everything. I recommend it. But if you find it particularly hard, you can always do that. And the other thing is that we're going to be talking about it, so you'll have kind of multiple ways of getting at it. What happens is that he does a lot. Let me, what was that, Rob?
No, listen to Shrikant on this. He's wrong.
Yes.
I have something to say about this too. Can I jump in really quick? One of the things we're going to learn from Louis Sullivan about form follows function, he says it means having a right start and a right finish. And so I will agree with Rob that the first time I read this, I did have a hard time getting through the first chapters and getting into it. But I hope maybe when we get through it all and get to the end, we can think about, you know, how this book is an example of form follows function and right start and right finish.
Sure, that's a good one. What I'm saying is that the initial chapters that we're going to do next, the first, I think it's going to be 5 or 6 chapters. I'll put that up later today, are all about the process of unlearning. It's all about showing the other person that, look, there is something wrong in what you are thinking. And they are all about clearing that ground. And so it may be, you may be a little bit puzzled, you know, why is he being so sarcastic? Why is he, you know, not coming to the point directly? But his whole point is to do the negative first, because if you have all those ideas, just like in John Boyd's presentation, you know, the destruction of what you held before is required for you to build something. So that's what is going on in these chapters. So if that helps you, you know, you can read it in order. It's okay. It doesn't, you know, that's fine. No, just kidding. All right. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Ash. If you have questions, you can go ahead and type a exclamation mark. Mike, what's your question?
Both a question and a comment. I like form versus function. I first learned about it by reading. I thought it was originally attributed to Mies van der Rohe.
Mike, let's not go too far off. Okay,
I need to set the predicate in order for this to be meaningful.
How about 1 minute?
1 minute. Okay. Yes. Well, I'll give you 30 seconds, and then
wonderful. You can, even better.
Even better. I like form versus follows function, but Rupali and even Rob said that isn't really what's happened. It's function follows form, or function follows materials and technology. As you see from the Greek, Roman, Byzantine progression, design is a compromise between a lot of things. I don't design buildings, but I've had a hand in designing many other things. And you find yourself doing a balancing act between many design parameters, weight, strength, speed, energy, physical, and even physical realizability. I think much of what Louis Sullivan, as a young man, was a draftsman, and he designed what they told him to design.
30
after that,
over 30 seconds, Mike.
Okay.
You made your point. Your question.
Well, let me fill 2 more sentences.
Go ahead.
After that, everything he designed was a basically steel frame curtain wall construction, as in my interpretation. And if it didn't fit into steel curtain wall technology, he said, go see another company.
All right, let me go ahead and have, it looks like what Mike is asking is that, is it really form follows function, or function follows form, or materials follow, start with, it starts with materials.
Design compromises
yes.
for the,
yes,
including agility and flexibility.
Sure. Okay, who would like to respond? You can just go ahead and unmute and speak.
The first thing is Corbusier also has this issue, this idea of form follows function, but he chronologically comes after Sullivan. So that's one of the steps where Sullivan's ideas are stretching. Remember how I said that Sullivan's ideas wrapped all the way around, went off to Japan, came back to Europe, and became part of European modernism. That's where Corbusier is picking it up. It's coming from that train of thought coming through. But whether it's form follows function or function follows form, I think this is one of the questions we should say, we will find this out as we read, because I think you need to dig in to what Sullivan is saying to get a better understanding of what he means by this idea.
Thank you, Sherri. I'd like to add, as an exercise, why don't we design something and build it ourselves? And once we do that, we can figure out whether form follows function or function follows form, and what ornamentation means to that. So one of the simplest exercises we did at our school with children was we designed a simple clay lamp. And we could take that, you can get clay and build a simple lamp and see if you want to contain wax or oil in the lamp, how would you design the form to take that, to make sure that it does the function of lighting something, or choose anything else that you would like to design. And that actually, as I said before, and I think Shrikant says this often, is if we create something, we can actually then start seeing how these ideas work in practice. So maybe as an exercise, if anyone would like to build something or create something, or we can have that as homework, and when we come back next week, we can share our findings.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. So I'll just add one thing. The way I see it, I think Mike's point is that you have to consider all the things that he said. You're looking at strengths, you're looking at flexibility, you're looking at all of this, but it is always from the perspective of what are you trying to do? What is the function that you're trying to accomplish? And in order to do that, you're using everything that you have in order to make it. That's the best way I can put it, but that's a very short answer. It's not a particularly good answer, but we're going to look at that in a very systematic way. So for example, when there was a presentation on John Boyd, people were asking, what is the purpose? What is the purpose? And the purpose for him, for John Boyd, was that of increasing your capacity of independent action. And in order to do that, you're doing all kinds of things, and you do have to keep track of all kinds of things, and you have to optimize all kinds of things. But then they're all kind of aimed at that. So that's an example of kind of form follows function in the OODA loop. But we'll look at it in detail. Next up is going to be Ash, Brian, and Tanya. Ash.
Yeah, so I have very limited familiarity with architectural theory and history, and I've never read Louis Sullivan before. So basically all I know about him is from the connection with the Fountainhead and things that Joia has told me before and what you guys have said in this conversation. But the impression that I get from that is, so my background is in philosophy, and this idea of form follows function and his looking to nature for inspiration, these ideas of, like going back to the seed and these kind of organic elements in his thought, all of this feels really straight out of Aristotle to me. And like form follows function in particular just seems like a very essentialized statement of the relationship of final causation and formal causation from Aristotle's theory of four causes, and the relationship between material and form and function. And so I'm just curious if any of you know if there was any direct or indirect influence on Sullivan's thought from Aristotle, or if you see any other connections or parallels there.
Right. Sherri, you had something?
No, I am not positive that he was directly influenced by Aristotle, but he was a very well-read man. So at that time, I would imagine that there's some influence, but really in his own descriptions, when you read Autobiography of an Idea, he credits a lot of his ideas as coming from spending time in nature, of seeing essentially cause and effect in action in nature, and that is part of the seed of his own ideas.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see to what extent he, rather than being influenced by Aristotle, he might have been influenced, at least indirectly, by Darwin, by the idea of natural selection. Because, form follows function is the idea straight out of natural selection, evolution by natural selection. The idea that if something has survival value, if it has a functional purpose for the organism, that will change the form of the organism. It will change the way the species is change the genetic code and the way the species grows. That's a very powerful root of form, a way of thinking of form follows function. And that would have been a very new and powerful idea right at the years before Sullivan was active.
That's true.
And possibly would have shaped his view of what nature is.
Yeah, Ash, that is a very good question. I mean, I think the commonality that I see in both those people, both Louis Sullivan and Aristotle, is the closeness to biological world. Like Aristotle had, his entire family has a base in biology. And so if you look at even just Aristotle's writing, his writing about life, like on soul, is much better than when he looks at physics, for example. And the difference is simply that he understands life better. And that kind of carries into rest of his things like Nicomachean ethics, but not so on physics. Physics, he kind of falls back onto kind of Platonic way of looking at things. But so same thing as Sherri was saying, Louis Sullivan is very familiar with life, and the patterns of life is what he has given words to in his thought. So I think that is the commonality that I see. All right. Next up is going to be Brian. Brian.
So I'm also very interested in this. I'm coming at it from a different angle. As a little boy, from Nebraska, the first big city I visited was Chicago. And I still remember the feeling of astonishment when I was walking through the Loop, the Mandanback Building, all of the department stores, hotels, the skyscrapers. Of course, they're not all Louis Sullivan, but I came away with that with just a sense of amazement that I did. I remember thinking, kind of like Mike has, answered to some extent, how did this ever arise? So I'm going to be very interested. There probably are a lot of different, factors and causes, but somebody had to bring them all together to put up these buildings. So I'm going to be very interested in seeing how that happened.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Tanya. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to say this. I'm going to try to say it quick so that Shrikant doesn't mute me and bump me out of the meeting. Because Chicago is the city to be, and seeing what real American architecture was. They tried everything. They were very free and willing to test out new ideas. Whereas in New York, they were still at that early skyscraper stage. They were very rigid and traditionalist. And so Chicago is definitely the city to see these ideas in formation, to see how they flower on the cityscape. One of the talks, I'm not sure which one it was, Shrikant, but one of the talks that Shrikant and I did before on Sullivan, I talked about maybe with the first one, I think. I talked about the Great Chicago Fire and how it wiped out a vast quantity of buildings. And I'm some astounding number, I can't remember off the top of my head, but most of the buildings in a very large area completely destroyed. And there was money brought in to rebuild. And there, because of the fire, of course, nobody wanted to build out of wood. So while things like the Mandanback Building, Rob used to work in that building, when we were first dating,
my first job out of college was in the Mandanback.
Yeah, so that is a masonry building. So if you happen to ever go to the Mandanback Building in Chicago, it's pretty fascinating, because if it's I think it's 10 or 12 stories high.
Yeah.
But if you stand at the base of the building, there are these caverns essentially where the windows are, because the base of the structure is something like 6 feet thick of masonry, because that's what was necessary to get it to 10 stories high. So that was the reason why new materials had to be made, because if they needed to get higher than 10 stories, and they needed to at that time, you couldn't do it out of masonry, because you would have such a tiny little floor plan and the walls would be like caverns, you know, between each window. So the Chicago style of architecture that you see in many, many buildings, and they're not all Sullivan, they're Jenny, they're all, there's Burnham and Root, there's a whole series of Chicago architects at that time, and they developed new ways of making skyscrapers that were full of light and air using brand new materials.
Brian, in response to your story of you coming from Nebraska and coming to Chicago, I'll give you my story of when I was living in Chicago and visited Nebraska. I was in Omaha. I got out of my hotel and I asked somebody, where is downtown? And they looked at me really funny and says, you are in the heart of downtown. So.
Yeah, I know. I'll just add, I lived in Chicago 8 years. I lived in Oak Park and became a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. So I really love his work. And so this will help. And I worked in the Loop for 8 years. I visited so many of these buildings. They really created an amazing environment, and just getting some background on that would be great.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, Chicago is where kind of the core of American architecture developed. New York, for all its greatness, looked too much to Europe to pick up ideas. Next up is going to be Tanya. Tanya, what's your question?
Hi, Shikran. Hi, everyone. I have a quick question for, I think her name is Rupali. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. You mentioned something about children and how you've worked with, or maybe worked with children in architecture. So how can children sort of get started with learning about architecture? Or I know this is definitely a book Sullivan is someone I definitely would recommend to say a cousin of mine. But like how could you see or what are some steps you'd recommend for a child just starting off learning about architecture?
So thank you, Tanya, for that question. I would say, children love to build. They just naturally love to build. I remember my son, he would build with little blocks, and those exercises in building with little blocks, wooden blocks, is very helpful because they learn about balance and stability. They learn about foundation. So you can start developing that language with them. Frank Lloyd Wright was certainly influenced by the Froebel blocks. So giving children the opportunity to build is very important. I think the other thing is children like to take responsibility. So giving them the responsibility to design something that is purposeful and meaningful. So for example, when you have an event at your house and you have people coming in, giving them the opportunity to design a menu. And there's a sequence, there is a form for it. There's, how are you going to make it appealing? All of those ideas kind of go within that. Also letting them draw and sketch, whether you take them outside. A lot of times our teachers will just take the children out in the yard and they watch they'll take little acorns that are on the ground and they'll sketch those acorns in great detail. The cap of the acorn has texture and the shape of the acorn is an oval, so you can start talking about basic geometry, textures, patterns that you see. And again, making meaningful projects at home. So things that you might want to design. For example, in India, while growing up, we would design our own Diwali lamps and build our own Diwali lamps with paper and foam core or other materials. And you can test them and try them, whether you want them to hang or you want it to kind of be lifted in the air. So you would design a thinner frame. So giving children materials, giving children opportunities to build, I think is the best way to get them to design, because then they can see where they fail. One of the most interesting projects at our school is the Gingerbread Castle project, where they can design a castle. We give them limitations or requirements. We tell them it can only be 2 feet by 2 feet. In its footage, and it has to be 100% edible. So whatever they are going to use to stick the pieces together, they all have to figure out what material are they going to use to make it edible, and also to be able to hold all the pieces and then all the decorations on top. Building prototypes, see if the prototype stands. When children actually build it in a concrete form, they can see all their ideas. Sometimes children will have a wild imagination. There was one child who designed like a very curved roof for the gingerbread castle. And we had to talk about how does the material behave? And then he ended up using little pretzel sticks one by one to kind of go over the arched frames. So giving children opportunities to really take a project and go through the entire process, reflect on what worked, what failed, and how you can make it better, I think will help children.
Wonderful, folks. So Sherri, go ahead.
A couple things. First, I agree completely with what Rupali is saying. Kids have got to build. I always found this a case in architecture school, that the students that literally did not build growing up, in some cases they were last year architecture students who would come to me, a first or second year architecture student, and ask them to help build a stud wall in their apartment, which is kind of frightening actually. But yeah, you have to build it no matter what it is, or make it, whether it's building models, sewing, anything that you're doing, you're working with the material, you're seeing how it reacts. And 2 other really quick things. For the curved roofs, Rupali, they should be using tweels because you can curve them. And then the other last little thing, just a gentle correction, everybody, and this is an incorrect story that Frank Lloyd Wright was influenced by the Froebel blocks. He didn't get the Froebel blocks until he was much older. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright's way of doing autobiography of himself. He told stories, and this is one of them. So the Froebel blocks, if you look at the date for when the Froebel blocks came out and how old Frank Lloyd Wright was at the time, you'll realize that's Frank Lloyd Wright stretching the truth.
Well, I stand corrected. Thank you, Sherri, for that.
You're welcome. But the Froebel blocks are cool. And one more thing, if you're trying to introduce children to architecture and building, there is a man, no longer with us, obviously, some time ago, but Mario Salvadori. He worked with some New York, I'm not sure which school, worked with some kids at a university program. They would go into the elementary schools of the inner city in New York and teach a course on architecture. They later became books. I'm not sure which one off the top of my head is really geared for kids, but you can look through them and find them. One of them is called Why Buildings Stand Up. And they really get into these situations to show kids what tension and what compression and suspension by physically creating that movement, that weight or that pull with another child. So they're great books for teaching kids what's really happening in a building.
Wonderful. Folks, we're going to run the breakout rooms for about 18 minutes so we can discuss this in greater detail and see you back here in 18 minutes, starting the breakout rooms now. Go next. Surabhi, you had a question or comment?
Yes, I had a question for Rupali auntie again.
Sure, go ahead.
So my question is, auntie, how do you think architecture has evolved and changed? You know, like if we compare like designs then and designs now, like how has it changed and how has it had an impact on, you know, people and culture and, you know, their thoughts overall?
That's a very good question. And I don't think I'll probably do justice to the entire question, and perhaps Sherri and everyone else can chime in too. But I'll start with, you know, architecture. If you look from prehistoric times to now, there is a huge development from going from cave structures to modern skyscrapers. And a lot depends on the materials and the needs of people. So what do people need? Starting from just protecting themselves from the elements and protecting themselves from animals to now, you know, the tall high-rise buildings to house people, to work together, to, you know, just so many different functions that we live in our society. So I think that's one way to start looking at architecture, is what were the needs of humans and how have the needs grown over all these years of our development. And so when we look at that timeline chronologically, we can see how architecture has developed, whether it's you know, the Egyptian times, the Greek times, Roman times, ancient India, ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia. They all offer a rich kind of look into what the cultures were and what their beliefs and their traditions were. So I think we had talked about this briefly when we talked about songs and poetry, that they give you an insight into how people think. And similarly in architecture, the buildings tell you what the culture of the people is. And when we look at materials, there's this whole technology that has developed, right? So why did we go from stone and brick and wood structures to concrete structures, and how that scientific development happened? So I think looking at the needs of humans that develop their social development and then the technological developments that have all attributed to the development of architecture is how I would look at it.
All right. It's wonderful to have both Rupali and Sherri here as architects, folks. It's, you know, I think we're going to get a lot of value. All we have to do is to make sure that we keep away from ferro cement. Then we'll be.
No, we can start there.
I would love to talk about it.
We have to talk about it.
What a coincidence. There are very few people who do ferrocement. And then Sherri did her thesis on ferrocement and I did mine. Completely different countries.
Okay, Joe, you have a question.
No, wait. I have something. Wait. No, so what we're talking about here is, and throughout all of human history and what Rupali's talking about different phases of architecture, they really do show you what's important in that in individual cultures. But what we're seeing as humans develop, we see new functions, we see new needs for buildings, we see new materials, new ideas for new technologies for materials like ferrocemento, which have a whole new form that takes place because it is the nature of the material. So at some point, we're going to have to talk about ferrocemento.
All
I
right.
think you're gonna have to do a presentation on that. The two of them.
Okay. So we've managed to not have you talk about politics, Rob. There must be some way of getting them not to talk about ferrocement. Joe, go
It'll
ahead.
be fascinating. You'll love it.
No, I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in when it comes to forms follows function is how it relates to software engineering. I brought that up in the breakout room and how that actually works with systems thinking and design thinking. But one of the things that questions that I have is that I guess COVID would actually impact the way we design everything now and how everything how like we are redesigning homes and everything that's working now. Would it not? That would be a good example of how, form follows function takes on a new way of designing homes, essentially, or even I say homes because those are the primary structures that are probably going to be redesigned as offices in a way. And then offices will be redesigned as well. So we're kind of seeing this in real time as, if our needs changing. And so I just wanted to see if they wanted to comment on that.
You definitely do see a big difference. But whether COVID's going to actually cause a need that's permanent or just a temporary need, I have a feeling that there's been a trend towards home offices long before COVID hit. So in house design, they would just use a spare bedroom or something like that. It wasn't like it was a whole new thing. We'll have to see if it really makes an impact where it becomes a special space that certainly is different than in the past. That we've seen that happening in the last 20 years with formal dining rooms. We don't live the same way we used to. And slowly that erodes away in house designs. But I think we might actually be seeing it more common, a bigger change from COVID in office spaces because and the reason is because the money's involved. All of a sudden, it may not make sense for companies to spend as much money on the infrastructure of their office buildings any longer. They may not. They may not need that. They may not have the funds to be able to do that. At the same time, a lot of people aren't as effective working from home as they are from an office space. So it might just be a temporary blip.
Can I just follow on to that really quickly? It's just that one of the things that I've been reading is how architects are going to have to redesign buildings to essentially accommodate things like automation now, because companies want to insulate themselves from future pandemics. So that this may actually drive a whole new revolution in just how you design supply chains and how you design, that would be interesting to me to see how this is like kind of externally this disease, even though it's may not just be COVID, it could be something else down the line, that they no longer want to have this problem anymore. And that'll be interesting to see how that impacts architecture altogether.
Yeah. It's actually, if anybody has ever done any research into what things happened from the medieval plagues, they had a massive change on economic structure of society. It really it broke down that feudal system and created the impetus for more modern type of economic structure where you could, if you wanted to, you could go get the land, farm the land, earn yourself money, buy a house in the city, and move up in society, where before you were born in whatever state you were at, in tough cities, that's where you were staying, so that there are positives that came out of some of those horrendous plagues from the past. I think we're seeing some of that will happen now too.
I'm just hoping they'll get rid of the cubicle and decide that's a health hazard and
Yeah.
actually build people offices with walls.
Yeah, but you know what? You still have airflow that goes between. So
I think, with COVID, there is also a silver lining to, what this pandemic has brought. And it's in the way we are thinking and rethinking how we live and how we function. I know we talked about office buildings, but I also know that schools are changing in many ways. And in terms of the structure of the schools to provide more open spaces, to Rob's point of not having little cubicles with health hazards. But I want to say, the book ends with optimism. And one of the things that Louis Sullivan talks about is the instant, and I'm quoting from the book, the instant that thought begins to change, that instant the power resting upon it and sanctioned by it begins its waning. Thus the decay of the old and the formation of the new are synchronous effects of one cause. The single cause is thought. It's the simplest aspect of all human activity, and that activity is change. So once having undergone change, it does not become the same again. However great the lapse in time, thus there's always birth, but never rebirth. So, Joe, to your point, this pandemic is going to cause all of us to, the whole world is going to change in ways that we haven't seen before. And again, the iterative process of design is you take something and then build on it and make it better, and then new things come from it that we haven't seen.
Oh, she comes to me. There we go.
Sorry about that. Okay, last question is from Ash. Ash, very quick question or comment.
Yeah, so on this question of does form follow function or does function follow form, I think this is the wrong question. Because it's by the way it's set up, it's kind of this binary false alternative. And really the issue is, what is the relationship between form and function? And function is an emergent property of biological systems. But once these kinds of higher order levels of organization emerge from the bottom, they always emerge from the bottom up, but once they do, they then in turn govern the lower order levels. So the answer to the question is, does form follow function or does function follow form is yes, in different ways, but there's actually this spiral relationship between them. And like Joseph brought up this issue of like constraints in our breakout room as well. And again, like constraints and potentialities and constraints come from both directions. Constraints on form come from the bottom up, from the materials you're working with, and from the top down, from the function or the purpose of what you're doing. So I think it's important to ask the right question so as not to get locked into one way of looking at something when actually there could be multiple aspects that are, or multiple ways that these different levels of analysis are interacting.
Wonderfully put, Ash. All right, folks. So any last comments about from either, any of the panelists? All right. So next up, we're going to dive into the book. I think it's going to be the first 5 chapters or so. I'm going to put that up very soon. I think it's definitely first 5 chapters. That's what we're going to do. That's a good unit. It's about maybe less than 20 pages, so it's not that much. The entire book is only about 160 pages, so it's a fairly short book. And the first 20 pages is kind of just introduction, and we'll take it from there. So the next meetup is about to begin. So thank you very much, everybody. Jyoti, if you have a quick question, we can do
It's
that.
very quick. I had put that in the chat. The question is, Sullivan's buildings, he came up with quite a few in a short period of time. Was there a common element in all those buildings that would depict?
Very good question. We will deal with it next time.
Okay.
Okay. I want to make sure that people who are coming in for the next meetup have enough time to kind of set things up, and we'll go from there. All right. But great question, Jyoti. We'll definitely get. If I forget it, please remind me. Okay. Thank you.
You'll be patient with me?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. All right. So folks, the next meetup coming up, we're going to have Bill Frezza here, and he's a columnist. He was a columnist, and he decided to unplug, to go dark, to disconnect from the 24-hour news cycle and social media. And he's going to be talking about what that does for you. And so it's about unplugging from the automatic news cycle and just responding to whatever is going on, to building an intellectual oasis of your own. So that's what is coming up at 5 o'clock. Nice. All right. So, and again, tomorrow, we're going to have Mark Stallman back. He's going to be talking about human engineering and modern psychology at 2:30. We have a philosopher, I forget his name. He's a Japanese philosopher who was a Zen Buddhist monk, talking about science, art, and the topic is going to be authenticity, power of authenticity. And at 5 o'clock, we are going to be visiting with Mr. Dante and his Divine Comedy. So that's what is coming up.
That sounds great.
All right, Rupali, thank you very much. Bye, Robin, Sherri. Bye, Joia.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Great presentations.
Thank you.
Are you keeping the room open?
Yeah, I'm going to keep the room open.
Can you listen to this next one if you haven't registered, sort of thing?
Oh, yeah. You can just stay around. You just
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah,
it sounds interesting a little bit.
Yeah, no, it is. It is very interesting. It's going to be just a very informal kind of conversation with him. So I'm just going to talk to him. And then we'll, of course, do the breakout rooms. And it's an important theme, because what happens is that many people are just plugged in so much, and they are just spending all their time responding to things. And there's no reason to do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sure, Count, I have a stupid technical question. How do you scroll back in the chat?
You just click on it. It depends on what you're using.
On my phone, on my iPhone.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't use iPhone. If there's anybody else who uses iPhone, can you answer the question?
Yeah, I just need to go back a little bit. Somebody sent me something and I didn't get it.
You can just click on it and maybe try to drag up or something.
No, it won't drag up. That's the problem. It stops. Right. Joe sent a very long text message, and so it won't drag past. It won't go up past that again.
Okay. I don't know, Laura.
Okay. Well, I sent a message out generally to her. I hope I get it back. I'll get there. Thanks, though.
Thank you.
Sure, the chat, is that only available at the time of viewing? Like when the cast cuts off, when you're finished your thing, is that the end of it? Like it doesn't go onto your YouTube video sort of thing?
No, the chat doesn't go to the YouTube video.
Okay, it's only available during the time of the
That's right.
session.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
I really need to be going off and do other things, but I kind of want to stay. I might hang out for a little bit. I have a work project. It's not done. It's due Monday, but I plan to be with you almost all of tomorrow.
Excellent.
So I didn't join for this one because I was like, okay, I'm not gonna do this one so I can get stuff done. But now I'm here and I'm like, but I don't want to leave.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. But I thought the start was great to the Louis Sullivan.
Yes.
Maritza, I think you're going to really like this.
I'm looking forward to it. You know, I'm also, I find I'm actually also fascinated to see how it plays out with some of the questions that, so Mike and Les didn't actually, he didn't say takeaways here in public, but in our chat, he mentioned some of his concerns with what he's read so far. He's already read the first 5 chapters, and he makes some valid points. I'm interested in seeing, because, you know, if you're looking at it from an objective versus a subjective view, how does somebody who usually likes, you know, less flowery language, more direct verbiage, and, you know, those type of more structured approaches to logical thinking, how would they
Right,
process?
that's a good, very good question. Very good point. Let me